was dubious. Rufus had not named him as his heir, and their elder brother Robert was still alive and ruling as Duke of Normandy. In the circumstances, Henry needed all the support he could get, and he turned dramatically to the hitherto despised English people. Kings traditionally swore an oath at their coronation in which they promised to rule justly and well. But Henry's coronation charter, of which this is the slightly later official government copy, was different. It was written down. It was widely circulated throughout the kingdom, and the promises were more far-reaching. Above all, it announced Henry's determination to carry out a legal counter-revolution and bring back the laws of Edward the Confessor. In other words, he would rule in the traditional way, with consent, like an Anglo-Saxon king, and not with force and extortion, like a Norman. Henry openly acknowledged the tyranny of his brother and father by vowing to take away all the bad customs by which the Kingdom of England was unjustly oppressed. The fundamental importance of the Charter wasn't lost on later generations. It was copied almost exactly in Magna Carta, and it was used by all the kings in between. But the Charter was only one of Henry's attempts at reconnecting his rule with the Anglo-Saxon past. He married a Scottish princess who was descended directly from King Alfred the Great, and he gave his only son and heir a double name. The boy was christened William, after the Norman conqueror, and Atheling, which is an Anglo-Saxon name meaning king worthy. There could have been no clearer demonstration of Henry's determination to found a new, genuinely Anglo-Norman dynasty. And an Anglo-Norman England was slowly beginning to emerge. The ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia and Northumbria were gone, along with the earls who'd ruled them. In their place were the Norman barons. The barons spoke French, but they increasingly claimed the rights of their English predecessors. Similarly, many Normans took Saxon wives, and their children and grandchildren began to think of themselves as much English as Norman. And alongside this fusion of cultures, a new social class was emerging, a class that would dominate our history for the next 1,000 years. By the time of King Henry, England was a heavily militarised society in which all landowners were expected to provide troops, either to their superior lord or directly to the king himself. The most important of these troops were called knights, that is, heavily armed soldiers on horseback. These too were a Norman innovation, as the Anglo-Saxons had ridden to battle but fought on foot. But the importance of knights went beyond the purely military, because knights were a social as well as a military elite, and they gave their name to a new code of values and behaviour called chivalry. The key idea of chivalry was that instead of killing your defeated enemies, you captured them and treated them honourably. At least you did if they were of the right social class. For chivalry was a purely class code. This too was a new idea, because the Anglo-Saxons had usually killed their defeated enemies, whatever their rank. Chivalry was the apex of this new Anglo-Norman culture. But its foundation was the bedrock of the old Anglo-Saxon state, the coinage. England's stable currency had been the envy of Europe for 3 centuries, but it was now under insidious attack. In 1124, Henry's soldiers began complaining that their wages were being paid in coins which were less silver than cheap tin. The result was what we're all familiar with: galloping inflation. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded, The man who had got £1 could not get the value of a penny for it in the market. Henry took decisive action, which the modern treasury could only envy. There were 150 men who made all the money in England. Henry had everyone arrested and sent for trial at Winchester. 94 of them were found guilty of debasement of the coinage. The punishment for what we would regard as a white-collar crime was barbaric. First, each one of the guilty men had his right hand cut off. Then, he was castrated. The vast majority of the moneyers weren't Norman. Instead, they were Englishmen of high rank. Even so, there was no popular protest. Here at last was something which united everybody, from the Norman king to the lowliest Anglo-Saxon peasant. Everybody was agreed that the value of the coinage, that great achievement of Anglo-Saxon England, must be protected at any cost. But the king was about to lose something more precious even than his coinage. This is the harbour at Barfleur in Normandy. Here, William the Conqueror's own ships were built, and here, on the 25th of November, 1120, King Henry and his court were about to embark to return to England after one of the king's many visits to Normandy. Then as now, members of the royal family travelled separately, and Henry's son and heir, William Atheling, together with his suite of over 300, including many of the cream of the young Norman nobility, were to sail in the White Ship. There was a party atmosphere. William had bought several casks of wine, and everybody, including members of the crew, had drunk heavily. They set sail in the evening, but within half an hour, disaster struck when the drunken pilot steered the ship onto a well-known hazard, a jagged rock that lay just beneath the surface at high tide. A great gash was torn in the side of the ship, and it sank within minutes. William's bodyguard managed to get his young master onto the only boat and began to row him to safety. But the young prince insisted on going back to try to rescue his sister. The little boat was overwhelmed as men desperately scrambled to get on board, and William and everybody else, bar a single survivor, was drowned. It was, as they say, a moment that changed history. For weeks afterwards, bodies were washed up along the Normandy shore, though the majority, including William Atheling's, were never found. Henry was devastated, and it was said he never smiled again. This was a personal tragedy that would in time tear the Norman dynasty apart. For the rest of his reign, Henry wrestled with the problem of the succession. At first sight, there seemed no shortage of possible heirs. Henry had been an inveterate womanizer, and he'd fathered a score of bastards. But none of the bastards, of course, carried the Anglo-Saxon royal blood of the dead prince, William Atheling. Nor did another possible candidate, Henry's nephew, Stephen. Stephen was a tried and tested warrior, and he was popular with the church and a large section of the baronage. But Henry rejected Stephen as well, and instead he decided that his heir should be his daughter, Matilda, named after her mother, Queen Matilda, and carrying also her mother's Anglo-Saxon royal blood. In 1127, Henry summoned a meeting of the baronage, including Stephen, and required them all to swear an oath of allegiance to Matilda and to recognize her as the future monarch of England. For Henry, this settled the matter. For everybody else, it raised the fundamental question of female succession and whether or not a woman should or could rule in a warrior age. If any woman could pull off that challenge, it was Matilda. She was an indomitable character, a woman who rode astride like a man and who led her army into battle. She also had powerful allies, as her husband was the Count of Anjou. But the Angevins were the traditional rivals of the Normans. So, if Matilda became queen, the English crown would pass, many Anglo-Norman barons feared, out of Norman control and into the hands of their arch-enemies, and that they were determined to stop. Matters came to a head in the autumn of 1135. Henry was on a visit to Normandy here when he suddenly fell ill. Within a week, he was dead. At his request, his embalmed body was taken for burial at Reading Abbey in the England that he'd made his own. But already, everybody had forgotten the oath of 1127. Instead, Stephen moved decisively to seize the throne and get himself crowned and acclaimed by the English. Stephen was popular at first, although he lacked the ruthless touch of his predecessors. But within a year or two, he had lost control over the barons. They began ignoring his commands, and some of them tried to carve out petty kingdoms for themselves, just like their cousins in Normandy. If they succeeded, it would be the death of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the situation. In the days of this king, there was nothing but strife, evil, and robbery, for quickly the great men who were traitors rose against him. When the traitors saw that Stephen was a good-humoured, kindly, and easygoing man who inflicted no punishment, then they committed all manner of horrible crimes. It's a sign of Stephen's lack of control over the barons that some of them start to mint their own coins in the centres of their regional power, just as in Normandy. This, for instance, is a penny minted by Henry, Earl of Northumberland, at York, and this is another minted by Robert of Gloucester at Bristol. It's the first and indeed the last time, apart from the Civil War of the 17th century, that an English king loses control of the coinage. But meanwhile, in Normandy, a more direct threat to Stephen's authority was brewing. Matilda maintained her claim to the throne, and she was gathering allies. And on the 30th of September, 1139, she landed on the Sussex coast with a large army, supported by Robert of Gloucester and demanding to be recognised as Queen. Norman England's first civil war was about to begin. In petty skirmishes and long sieges, the armies of Stephen and Matilda fought it out across the length and breadth of England. And the rules of chivalry only prolonged the conflict. When Stephen captured Matilda, he dutifully released her, even granting her safe conduct. Matilda then took control of most of the west of England, with Stephen holding the eastern part of the country. The fate of England now lay in the hands of two French cousins, fighting each other for the crown. On the 2nd of February, 1141, the most dramatic incident of the civil wars took place here at Lincoln. King Stephen and his army were here in the city, high on its hill, whilst below on the plain were Matilda's troops. It was the feast of the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or Candlemas, and King Stephen carried the customary candle to Mass, held in the cathedral. But as the candle was being lit, it broke apart in his hands. Despite the ill omen,